Good morning and welcome to this Learn with Lorna. I'm going to do my normal wait for a second before I start talking. So yeah, welcome to the 36th Learn with Lorna. It's really nice to have you with me. It's really nice to welcome you back into my house for the 36th time this year. I can't believe it's December and we're already that far into the year. Thank you, as always, for the people saying hello and commenting and sending me messages. And thank you to all of those who let me know last week, why they watch and if this is helping them get through lockdown or if it's helping them with their studying or all sorts of different things. So, and I appreciate all of those messages and all of the emails that I've had subsequently as well. So please, if you haven't done so, please do just let me know what you get from these talks and if you enjoy them and what you're using the information for. A reminder before I go any further that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these events. But if you're in a position to be able to donate towards our work, we would very much appreciate that. As with so many different industries, heritage is going through a tricky patch. So if you're in a position to be able to donate, then we would really appreciate that. This is the third session that I have done on the asylum. So if you're interested in the asylum and you haven't seen those earlier ones, please do go back onto our YouTube channel, the High Life Highland YouTube channel, and have a look at those previous films. I'm going to open this one today by saying that just a very brief overview. As I say, I've done two previous sessions, so I don't want to go again into the whole history of it, but a very brief overview, which is that the Inverness District Lunatic Asylum, as it was called when it was opened, was seated on the top of a hill overlooking Inverness, an absolutely beautiful location overlooking the town. It was opened in 1864, and it was the third district asylum to be opened in the country. It was unusual in that it had an enormous catchment area, so it covered the vast majority of the Highlands and Islands, so covered the Western Isles and so on. So a very large catchment area with people coming who were bilingual. So quite an unusual asylum in that respect. I'm just seeing all your hellos coming in. Someone asking if these are available to view after the live. Yes, they are. You can go back and watch them on the High Life Highland YouTube channel or here on our Facebook pages as well. So we hold a huge collection of records relating to the asylum. We hold them on behalf of the Highland Health Board, NHS Highland. A huge collection including minutes, annual reports, financial records, staffing records, a fantastic series of comparative reports, so reports that look at how the Inverness Asylum was compared to other asylums in the country. These would look at comparisons of food, of treatment, of property, statistics, all sorts of things. And there's information about more information about property, from anything from the plumbing to the installation of electric lighting. So a huge and diverse series of records with a lot of uses, some of which I've talked about in previous weeks. What I'm going to focus on today are some admission registers and the case notes. These are where most of the stories are found, and as you'll know if you've heard me speak before, that my passion is for the human story and the experiences that people have lived with. These case notes and admission registers reveal all sorts of things. They reveal people from diverse backgrounds. So there are ministers in there who have been driven to being in the asylum by the stress of their work. There's a teacher from Dingwall in there who apparently was admitted to the asylum because she went mad on the day that she was due to marry somebody. He left her because of her mental issues, and on the day that they were due to get married, he married her sister instead. There's a 26-year-old Jewish picture framer in there who's had Hungarian parents. He had been in a mental health system in Vienna and came to Inverness Asylum from Inverness Prison. So there's all sorts of different diverse and different backgrounds in these records. They also show that people have had really diverse life experiences. So, for instance, there is someone who was a gold digger. And I've mentioned this before because when I do work with Milburn Academy using these records, I always have to explain that this is not a gold digger in the financial sense. This is an actual gold digger who had been away in the colonies, I'm not sure where, but had suffered what might now be called health anxiety and hypochondriosis, and so was very concerned about his health with everything that happened to him. There were servants in these records who you could see the impact of a quarrel with their master or mistress, and how the fear of causing displeasure to the person who controls your life to some extent was a crushing blow. So there's all sorts of different life experiences in these records. And there are all sorts of different ages. I saw one the other day when I was flicking through it, which was a 14-year-old girl, and it said that she had first been treated when she was 12. There are people in there in their 80s. And there are some people who are in because of a recent cause, something that's just happened to them, and some people who went into the asylum because of something that had happened in their past but had continued to have a huge influence on their life. So the reason I'm kind of starting by saying all of that is that it proves the point which I'm quite sure we all agree, that mental health problems can hit anybody at any point, at any age, at any stage of their life, from any background, whatever their life experience has been. These things can hit people. Some of them have very obvious, what we would see as an obvious trigger. We can see there's a very obvious reason why someone has gone into that state. And for other people, there's no obvious trigger. And so I always think it's important to start by saying that these historic records emphasize what we know, that there is a chance for any of us to be affected by a mental health issue at some point. I'm going to go on and talk about 4 specific patients, but before I do, there's a couple of things I wanted to say straight away. One is that the mental health records are closed for 100 years. They have a 100-year closure period on them for data protection. So all of the stories that I have mentioned and that I'll go on to mention in this talk are from the 1800s. So anything post 1920, I wouldn't be talking about. The second thing, and I've certainly made this point in previous episodes about the asylum, is that I am not medical trained in any way, shape or form. If there are any medics watching, and I know quite often people who have worked in mental health have watched these talks, so if there is anyone working, then I'm sure they would be maybe interested in giving their input into some of these cases. So yes, please don't take my word on anything that's medical facts. Sometimes there are happy endings, sometimes there are not. And I don't want to pretend otherwise. So these records, I am not going to pretend that all of them have good outcomes and have good news stories in them. But I'm very conscious that December is a hard time of year for some people. It can be quite a lonely time of year for people. And I deliberately wanted to focus largely on stories that had positive outcomes. I think it's very important for us to know that those positive outcomes are there, and that in those records there is proof that of people who have come out of the other side of mental health problems with a positive result. And most importantly, before I tell these stories, as I've said time and time again, this is not a showcase of people who have been suffering. I'm not wanting to use this as a kind of show and tell, really, of kind of profiting from people's misery in any way, shape or form. What I want to do is reveal the extent of these collections and reveal the sort of content that's in them. I want to remember the lives of these people. I don't see why the people who have been in the asylum should be forgotten while other lives are remembered and commemorated. But also I think we can really see in these records how much these experiences that happened 100, 150, 170 years ago have shaped knowledge, they've shaped science, they've shaped the skills of the people who work in our mental health services now. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. And I know I've said that on previous weeks with engineering as well, that we go through things and we learn from them, and then that's how we develop a better system. So I want to tell you about 2 men and 2 women. I'm going to start by talking about Margaret, or Marjorie, she gets called both, Kennedy or Gillis. So she has two alternate first names, alternate surnames. She was a 36-year-old servant. She was a pauper. And she had previously been at Englishton House, which was a private asylum just outside Inverness. She was from the parish of Boleskine and Abertarf, which is on the side of Loch Ness. And she entered the asylum on the 12th of July 1864, and she was the 115th patient, so she'd gone in just as the asylum was opening. I've said previously that for every patient they did they had a warrant to certify why they had to be in the asylum, and also when they arrived they did a physical examination and a mental examination, and they would write down a description of the patient. And I know I have said before that it's extraordinary to look at these and be able to see a description of someone that maybe otherwise you would never be able to get. And so they describe that she is in good bodily health but poor mental health. And Margaret is one of those people who would have what we would maybe see as a very obvious trigger. There'd been a very obvious reason that she had got into the system of the process of being having a mental health issue. And that was the fact that her husband had died on the same day that her child had been born. And that had happened 3 years previously, but it was, of course, still having an effect on her life, which is completely understandable. And she had previously come to the attention of people in the mental health system, so she had been in an asylum previously. The physical exam taken on her arrival said, I'm going to read the exact wording, said that she was rather tall, bony, and fresh-coloured with a vacant expression. Her head was well formed, her hair was black, and she had brown eyes and irregular teeth. And she wouldn't allow any examination to happen. But the doctor thought that largely she was in good physical health. When she first entered the asylum, she chose the seat behind the door in the ward so that she could watch people. And she stayed there. And it said that she was perfectly silent, except if she was asked a direct question, she would answer, but only monosyllabically. So she was very quiet. And they wrote in her case notes, she devotes her time to the care of her hands, which she constantly keeps closed, her fingers being shut firmly over her thumbs. So long, indeed, had they been allowed to maintain this position, that at last an offensive odour attracted attention, and on being forced open, they were found to enclose chicken bones, buttons, and other articles that she apparently set a great value on, and it was found that the nails had actually grown into the palms. So she's not in a great state, and she's clutching hold of something that she feels is very important to her. In addition to that, she felt like she was being tormented, and she felt she could hear a child talking to her. I find it interesting to see the impact of the mind on the body. So her mental state was causing her to grip onto something so hard that she had caused pain to her hand. And so they found that they couldn't talk her into opening her hands, but they forced her hands open. And they took out the things that she was holding, and they replaced them with a roll of cotton, so that she would still be holding something for comfort. So if she was getting comfort and support from gripping something, they replaced that with something else that wouldn't do her any harm. And every day they changed what was in her hand. They continued to give her a ball of cotton, but they made it slightly larger each day so that the contraction of her joints would be overcome. Within time, by May 1865, her hands had released enough that she was able to knit and sew and clear the dining room table. But her mental health didn't improve as much, and she was still felt like she was tormented, and she would attack the attendants, and she was violent and angry, and she had to be kept. She slept in a separate room. But she carried on secreting things. She carried on taking things and holding them close to her. And it said that she carried on a constant war with a couple of the attendants. She ran away one day to Inverness to attend the chapel, and she was very proud of herself. She said when she came back, she told everybody that she'd made it to the church for Palm Sunday. And they describe her mood swings. So they said that she was either very pleasant and very industrious, or on the turn of a coin, she would become aggressive and angry. It's very interesting, as I'm saying, they use these cases to learn, and you can see this as they treat her, that they worked out how to manage her better. And so they said that we realised that no kind of coercion or forcing her to do anything didn't get anywhere, it just made her worse. But what they did find out that is if they appealed to her better feelings, they could generally get her into a better position to be able to help. So just interesting the way they targeted treatment for different people, what's going to work for each individual patient. But they noted sadly in 1874 that although she was getting slightly better, they didn't know if she would ever be fully cured. And on the 11th of November 1874, Margaret left the asylum, and she left because a letter was sent to the Boleskine and Abertarf parochial board, who'd been paying for her care, was sent to them by a group of her friends who said if she left the asylum, they would all get together and try to support her and look after her. But I was sad to notice on flicking through the volume a little bit later that she was back in at least one more time. So that's quite a sad story, but I think it's an interesting example of how they tried to tailor their treatment to people. And also, as I say, that image of her clutching something and then replacing it with something that was safer and then letting it bigger and bigger so that her hands would release. There's a care there about the way they tried to look after her. The second woman I wanted to tell you about is another Margaret. She is Margaret Wilson or Margaret McTavish, and they get two names because one would be their maiden name, one would be their married name. And she went into the asylum on the 20th of December 1864. She was 23 years old and she was a domestic servant, and she was a member of the Free Church. And they say that there was no cause initially known. They didn't know initially why she had gone into the asylum. But she was restless and she was weak with exhaustion and she was very destructive. But soon they realised that they thought that they had worked out the cause of why she had gone in. And I'll read you the extract from her case notes. It said, "The true cause of this patient's illness has never been satisfactorily ascertained, although it is more than probable to be attributed to the moral impression made upon her by the condition in which she unfortunately finds herself." So she had become pregnant. "And the consequent feeling of shame and acting upon a passionate, if not proud nature, compelled apparently by her friends to marry to save herself from disgrace." So she had become pregnant before she was married. Her friends had told her that she should get married, and she had done that. But then they say that 5 hours had scarcely elapsed after her marriage when it was reported that she suddenly rose, violently attacked her sister-in-law, imagining that harmful substances had been added into her tea. And they note that the people around her were kind, and they tried to calm her, and they got her calmed down. But several more times this happened. She woke in the night and attacked her husband, and it happened a few more times. And so eventually they were worried for the health of the baby. They thought that maybe these huge outbursts might result in her miscarrying the baby. And so she was taken into the care of the asylum. And when I spoke last time, somebody absolutely correctly commented that the asylum, an asylum was a place of care, a place of safety. And I think that in this case, that they were worried for the baby, they were worried for her own health, and so they took her in to safety. And they note that at first she was very excitable and very accusatory, and she was accusing the attendants of things. She was attacking the staff in the asylum. But gradually, this level of excitement faded, but she became immobile and she had a very low pulse. And she had been given opiates to calm her down, and she'd given a tonic for her nervous system. And so her speed of excitement controlled, but it left her very, very placid. And they say that in one of these states, she went into labour. And after 2 hours, she was safely delivered of a small, fully developed, healthy girl, which I find that's very interesting for the first baby, 2 hours. And the next extract in the minutes I find incredibly sad. And again, as I've said, I'm not a doctor, but this says to me very much that this might have been postnatal depression, and maybe one of the nurses watching will be able to comment. But they said in the notes, "She only for one moment exhibited any of that strong maternal instinct so marked at such a time, and after kissing her child, gave it to the nurse, and then manifested no active interest in its welfare afterwards," which I just truly find very sad. But a later entry says she never asks for her child, though at times she follows the person who is caring for the child with her eyes, like with the stealthy look of an animal. So she's obviously aware that the child is hers and she's protective towards it in some respect. They note that they struggled to make her get up or to have any enthusiasm for anything. And then suddenly she became very suspicious of the doctors and started to refuse any medication. She wanted her husband to take her home, but they noted that every time her husband came in, she was always worse. She was always in a worse state when her husband came in, and so they wouldn't let him take her away. This is where it becomes, I know I said at the beginning I'm going to focus on positive stories. From here on in, we're positive. Okay, it's an entry in 1866, and it says that 3 months ago, she had come to trust one particular doctor. There's a Dr. Mitchell. She's come to trust him and be friendly towards him. And then it notes that Dr. Mitchell saw a pattern in her behaviour and in the pains in her body. So sporadically she would say that she had severe cramps, she had severe backache, a headache, and she would become aggressive. And I think the key here is that she had come to trust this one doctor. He saw the pattern and he realised that she was in a worse state at certain times of the month, and so he suggested that they targeted the treatment to tackle her hormones and the cycle of her body every month. And he thought that could be pinned, that system, that cycle of the body could pin down what the problem was, that it was a hormone imbalance. And her case notes finish with these words. This was accordingly done through the instrumentality of Dr. Mitchell, and in a few weeks it followed by the happiest of results. The delusions gradually disappeared. She expressed her regret towards the staff for her unfounded dislike towards them. Her affection for her child returned, and she ultimately became a most agreeable inmate. She was dismissed, cured, on the 1st of March, 1866. Love that. A reminder before I come on and tell you the stories of the two men that I want to talk about. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, we would appreciate that. See, I've got a big grin on my face now because I'm so happy that everything came good and that someone took the time to really understand what the issue was and that it succeeded and that she built that relationship with her child. Okay, so the first man I'm going to talk about is called Robert Alexander, and he is patient 458. And I say man, but when he entered the asylum on the 29th of January 1869, he was 15 years old. I want to tell you his story for a couple of reasons. One is that he was 15 years old, and that's relatively unusual, but also because he's listed as a reformatory boy, a reformatory school boy from Edinburgh. He suffered from, I'm going to say chorea, which is a neurological illness, which produces very sudden movements in the limbs. It's from the Greek word for dance, so it's you get an image of the sudden movements of the body. And so he was a pupil at the reformatory school. Now, a little bit of background on the reformatory school means something before I tell the story. The reformatory school was responsible for the education of juvenile delinquents, and in Inverness, the reformatory school was established in 1853, and it was for children who had come to the attention of the police. And it was the superintendent of police who would make a list of potential children to attend, and then he would select the children that he thought would benefit most from attending the reformatory school. Initially, it was boys and girls who attended, but after the first building was destroyed, they moved to a second building, and there weren't enough girls kind of in the police's there weren't enough girls who were juvenile delinquents for them to justify having separate female accommodation, so it became just a boys' school. And they took boys from right across the country, and Robert Alexander had come from Edinburgh, and the school taught trades and it taught educational subjects. They had a tailor's shop, and the tailor's shop made all the clothes for the pupils. And so when Robert Alexander is listed in the asylum records, he's listed as reformatory school pupil and tailor. So that was obviously the trade that he was taught at the school. The school had very high standards, and it had won some awards at an international kind of competition of different reformatory schools. And most of the pupils, the statistics showed, didn't re-offend or didn't offend when they had gone into that school. And I think for some people with very high spirits, it was a way of just pushing them in the right path and not the wrong path. So Robert had been here and had trained as a tailor. He's listed as 14 days insane, but they say they don't know the cause. But the school had become worried. It was a boarding school. The school had become worried because he wouldn't eat and that his physical illness was so severe that he was exhausted because the condition had made him constantly move. So he would dress and undress and get up and walk about and move all the time. So he couldn't even sleep at night because he would be moving constantly. He had become quite quiet and tearful and was so tired and exhausted. And he heard voices. He pictured that there were rats running about him at night. And he was taken into the asylum on an emergency warrant initially because the school was so worried about him. The description says, he is a diminutive little fellow, blue-eyed with light brown hair and thick lips, ears and nose. Teeth are very much decayed, but his clothes are good because, of course, he would have made them. They said that it was hard to examine him because his physical illness meant that he moved so much that they struggled to get a physical illness. And they say that his illness was marked by exaggerated contortions of every limb and a positive inability to be at rest for even a single second. And so he was watched to prevent injury to himself that might have happened accidentally. He continued to refuse food, and this became a concern to the staff of the asylum. And eventually, after trying everything, they resorted to what's listed as compulsory alimentation. Now, I don't know, as I've said, I'm not a doctor, but my feeling is possibly that's force feeding. They note that they had to be incredibly careful because he had such a slight build, and because of the movement of his illness, they had to be very careful trying to feed him. But the violence of movement eased, and after a few weeks, the hallucinations and illnesses the images and the voices started to recede too. And this is his final extract. He began eventually, after much encouragement, to play the flute, to read, and to converse a little. Then he started to go into the tailor's shop, and after a few weeks, although no special treatment had been attempted beyond feeding him well, he recovered a sound state of health. He was put on medication of iron pills and cod liver oil, and as he continued well, he was discharged, cured on the 14th of April, 1869, after 3 months. And finally, and I know as I do often, I'm running late on time, but I want to tell you the story of William Macleod, and I guarantee you, although some of these stories are sad, we will leave here with a smile on our face with this story. So William was aged 64. He was admitted on the 8th of January 1866, and he was a weaver, and he was married, and he was from Cromarty. He had had a previous bout of melancholia, they noted, when he was 37, but they didn't know why that had happened. But this particular attack had been on and off for 11 years, so he'd been in and out of a melancholic state for over 11 years. They note that there was no hereditary illness. He wasn't dangerous or suicidal, but they noted that he had a severe dejection of spirits. He was careless and negligent of himself, so he wasn't looking after himself. He was fond of darkness and solitude, and he had a great watchfulness and aversion to society. He was in sound bodily health, but he stated that he couldn't think of going outdoors or even rising out of bed because of an unaccountable fear or dread that seized him. And I don't know about you, but that's certainly something that I can understand. He had very despondent views of himself, and his wife said that he only would get out of bed after dark and when all the doors are bolted. And again, as I keep saying, I'm not a doctor, but that sounds to me like agoraphobia, and it sounds to me like depression. And there's a very detailed description given of him. It says he's largely in good health, but in good physical health. But his principal mental symptoms were listed as an undefinable feeling of depression, which he couldn't throw off, and a belief that it was impossible for him ever to recover. He had pain in his stomach, so he would get cramps and pain in his stomach. He had palpitations, and he had breathlessness. And he was checked for heart problems. That was what they thought it might be, but it was absolutely ruled out. And they said, there's no heart condition here. This is something to do with depression and mental health instead. And they noted, after studying him, they noticed that he was very sensitive to temperature. So adjustments in the temperature would change how he slept. And they noted that if he slept well, that his feelings of hope improved. And I know I've quoted this before, and my colleague Fiona will laugh at me. I'm going to say it again. It's a famous quote of hers in our work: sleep is everything. And that's noted here as well, the difference that good sleep made to him. A further entry shows that he was very kind of sensitive to impressions and feelings. And so he had a dream that all wasn't well with his wife. And in panic, he wrote to the inspector of the poor and said, please go and check on my wife. I've got a sort of premonition that something's not right with her. And of course, she was absolutely fine. But the strength of the impression that made on him was enough to make him worry and get someone to go and check. And that's a very exhausting way to live. A further entry reveals that they had found out a bit more about his backstory. So they'd found out that he had gone to Dundee 12 years previously. He'd been really taken by Dundee, as you may well be, and had immediately moved his family there, relocated everybody from the Highlands to Dundee. But soon he'd been overcome with regret and remorse about the move. It had just all been too much for him. The dramatic uprooting from his home to a new place had been too much for him. And he felt very isolated in Dundee. He felt that he was surrounded by strangers. He didn't know anybody. He couldn't bring himself to feel like his house was home because he was so homesick. He couldn't bring himself to have any affection for the place. And gradually he had been overcome by a depression that he couldn't shake, and it had made it too hard for him to go to work. He'd got worse and worse, and eventually the family had to come home to Cromarty because things had got so bad with him, unable to work and unable to cope. And then he said himself during his inspection, he said to one of the doctors, I've only left the house 10 times in 10 years. And he had refused to see anyone. Even his closest friends had come to the door and he would shut himself in a room. He thought it was impossible. It was too much pressure to speak to anybody, to go out of the door, to rouse any kind of exertion, to get up. It was just all too much pressure for him. And he said that the crunch point had come when he couldn't bring himself to look on the face of his own child. So, something which I suspect is quite common to some extent or another. And that stage was when he was brought into the asylum. And for a time, he watched the events in the asylum, and they noted in quite a nice turn of phrase, they said he was a silent actor. So he watched what was happening. He watched people moving about. He just sat silently and watched the other patients. Gradually, they say the varied routine in the establishment made him communicative and brought some energy to him. And so he began to be a little bit more involved in what was happening in the asylum. He became interested in the other patients and finding out what was wrong with them and finding out about the staff. Became involved in the community aspect of the asylum. And as I've said on previous weeks, they had a regular ball, a dance, football clubs, things like that. So he gradually became more and more involved in these things. Eventually, he asked if he could take part in the morning prayers at the chapel. He asked if he could take an active part in it, and he was allowed. And he went on to lead the morning services. And the final paragraph of his case notes says, "At last, roused by the conviction that the portion of life still allotted to him might be one of usefulness, and touched by the interest manifested in him, he left the institution happy and grateful and looking hopefully to the future. He was dismissed, cured in April 1866. So he suffered gradually worse and worse and worse for 11 years. And then he went into that asylum And after 3 months, he came out saying, my life, I still have life left, and I'm going to make it something worthwhile. And I hope, I really hope that that story helps somebody who listens to this, and that William's hope that his life would now be of, that what was left of his life would be of help to somebody. I really hope that that comes true through this story. I'm absolutely not going to pretend that that the answers are all there, or the answers are all to be found within these records, or that the same thing will work for everyone. And we've seen that through these case studies, that for some people medication was the cure, for some people friendship and family was, for some people community, routine, a healthy diet, getting a good night's sleep, all of those things. I'm sure any nurses or doctors watching will say all of those things can contribute to good mental and physical health. So I wanted to tell some positive stories. As I say, it can be a difficult time of year for people. Sometimes it's a little bit lonely, but there are stories of hope out there in the past and in the present, and there are happy endings to be found in these mental health records, and it's really important that we remember that. Thank you for all your comments. It's been lovely seeing comments coming in. Lovely having, I think we had about 110 people so watching live, and then obviously that will pick up later on with subsequent views as well. So thank you for that. I hope you've enjoyed this week's talk and another look into the asylum records. And I will do another one of these into the new year. I know when I started these in April, I didn't know how long they would run for, but I suspect they'll be running for a fair while yet. Next week, I'm going to be looking at the fantastic Hetty Munro collection, which is held in our Nucleus, Nuclear and Caithness archives. So I really hope that you can join me for that. And a reminder that these talks are brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that no payment or subscription is required. But if you're able to donate, then we would very much appreciate that. And thank you, everybody who's saying it's been uplifting and positive. That was absolutely what I hoped to get out of this. So thank you for joining me.